Joining us now is Nida Khan. She's an independent journalist and analyst based in New York City. How are you? Thanks for joining us.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. And I should also say, also a friend, and been meaning to have you on for a while. So let's start. I think we'll move more specifically into how I think that there really is some shifts in how, maybe not necessarily in how this is being reported in the mainstream press in the United States, but I do think public opinion on this issue is shifting on Israel-Palestine, and I think we could talk about some of the competing narratives that you hear kind of going around about this issue, and that's something you write about and think about a lot. But let's just start with the latest news. I mean, basically, with the ground invasion in Gaza after the airstrikes, we're talking about, I think, a death toll that as of today is 548 Palestinians. Many of them are civilians, obviously. I think now, I don't know, I know that several Israeli soldiers have died in the conflict. One Israeli civilian was killed with rocket fire. And then, of course, the abduction and murder of the 3 Israeli teenagers, which it did precipitate this crisis, but I actually think we need to unpack that a little bit because the Netanyahu government used that incident in a profoundly cynical manner in terms of geopolitics, but also just in terms of tremendous human cruelty to the families of those teenagers that were killed. So, but anyways, and now we have the UN and the U.S. Calling for a ceasefire. Hamas is still not on board. For, I think, probably many reasons. So that's the kind of lay of the land right now. What's your big picture take on where we are right now, several days into this? And I think, again, we shouldn't even really call it a crisis because this is it's just an amplification of what this situation basically is on a day in and day out. Yeah, I mean, this isn't a unique. This is the situation, just amplified.
Right, absolutely. And it's just, I mean, it's to the point where I literally cannot physically look at these images anymore. It's just beyond heartbreaking. Like you mentioned, there's over 500 people that have been killed and thousands that are injured and wounded. And a majority of them, of the Palestinians, are civilians. I mean, you have hospitals that have been targeted, just places of worship all around. And every morning I feel as if the headline is, this is the bloodiest day so far. This is the bloodiest day. And it's like, wow, when is this going to end? When is the world actually going to step in and say, this needs to stop? Not, talks, not let's go over here and have a ceasefire discussion. We need to see actual action to make this bloodshed end. I was looking at Ayman Mohaldin's tweet earlier, and he was saying how surgical strikes killed 70 people in one neighborhood alone today. Yeah. Absolutely outrageous, inhumane, and for the world to just sit back and allow this happen is just, I literally am to the point where I just don't even have any words anymore. I know you've seen me on Twitter go off. It's just beyond heartbreaking.
Absolutely. So that is the human dimension of it, and I think again, I think that's very clear. I don't think Jon Snow. This was a big interview that was going around on British television, a BBC interview. Jon Snow, veteran British interviewer, had on Mark Regev, who's a spokesperson for the Netanyahu government, and he was basically just saying, "Look, you are proving that you basically cannot do these operations, period, without a significant civilian death toll. So doesn't that, by definition, require of you a different strategy, a different thought process?" I think there's no question about that. So let's get, and we're going to move back to this human dimension because I think that's very fundamental to talking about how potentially perceptions of this view are shifting, and maybe in specific communities, in the Jewish community in America. Right. But let's get... Right.
And perception, and sorry, not to cut you off, but perception is very important, and perception is reality. And while I agree with what you said earlier, that sentiment is changing because there are things like social media where people are able to circumvent some of the traditional media that may be ignoring certain realities or maybe, putting a certain narrative out that may not be depicting a true balance of the situation. While that's great, I feel as if here in the United States, a majority of the people that if they're not in certain circles, if they're not following certain people on Twitter, they don't necessarily see those images. So they're still believing everything that they're spoon-fed. And a lot of that is the talking points from people like Regev and like Netanyahu, who amazingly sit there and try to justify the killing of these innocents. And what's even worse is when you have people like Bill Maher, who are from the supposed left that sit and spew a lot of the same things that they do. And that, I'm like, I know you saw me go off on Friday about that too. It's just, it's just ridiculous. It's the utter dehumanization of Muslims so that it's to the point where if you don't view these people as actual civilians or as actual human beings, then who really cares if their children are dying anyway?
Well, that's actually the fundamental point. I wanted to get into some of the politics of the ceasefire, but maybe we'll pivot back to that later because you've actually raised the fundamental points here. And I think that that basically, and I say this again, I always say this, I say this as someone with Jewish background. I'm not officially in the tribe because my father's Jewish. My mother is only part Jewish. So, I guess depending on your definition. But I have significant Jewish background, and this is a conversation I've been around for a long time in a number of different ways. And for me, the fundamental distinction always rested on if you accept the basic premise that Palestinians are human beings, and I mean this like very bluntly, then this situation is entirely it's not durable and it's entirely unjustified, period. Right? If you accept that basic premise. Now, I think that really has been the underlying, that's the political context for Islamophobia, as an example. Obviously, it's in American foreign policy and in drones and in Guantanamo and all the rest. But the sort of push of mainstreaming and dehumanizing Muslim communities and Arab communities more generally, because obviously many Palestinians are Christian. That's always sort of important to note. But I think that's
always left out too.
That's definitely left out, and there's that's clear why that would be left out. But I think that I'm wondering. So even with let's take it to Bill Maher. Bill Maher, and it was amazing because basically to give everybody, in case you missed it, Bill Maher basically sent out this tweet where he said basically, I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't remember the exact wording, but his point was, because I can never actually, I just can't have a joke that was that unfunny be retained in my brain. It just sucked. But the point was that the joke was basically Hamas is like a crazy woman who's trying to kill you, and you can only hold her wrists for so long before you need to slap her. And it was fascinating because, Bill Maher, who, his two things have always been, like, I don't know what his dating record was like in college or whatever, but like he's got issues with women and has absolutely no idea what he's talking about when it comes to Islam and the Middle East, and he's got he's got an Israel fixation. But I think that what is interesting is that, I don't think a couple of years ago, I think a lot of people would have ran with and have ran with obviously the misogyny of that tweet and just how kind of bizarre that analogy is. But I don't think that there would have been the same type of specific reaction to, dude, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And again, and I say this as someone who condemns Hamas all the time. I think Hamas is a loathsome, despicable terrorist organization, absolutely. But the reality is that that does not describe in any way, shape, or form the situation, and it's a profound dehumanization. So I want to know, in addition to you going off, do you think that type of sentiment from Bill Maher is a lot less acceptable than it may have been a couple years ago?
Actually, sadly, unfortunately, I don't. I don't know if you watched his show on Friday, but when he made statements like, well, okay, so I would urge I don't know if I want to give him more ratings, actually, but, but if you did happen to catch it, first of all, his entire panel on this topic didn't include one Palestinian whatsoever. If you're
Right.
going to discuss an issue that requires a nuanced and in-depth conversation and that is so polarizing, you need to have both sides represented. How are you, as the supposed liberal, progressive voice, going to even attempt to have this discussion without that? That's
Right.
number one. And then secondly, he discussed the death of these children, and I'm paraphrasing too, but saying that, while it's very sad that they died, we have to look at what their mothers, fathers, and uncles are doing, as if they're the ones launching the rockets.
He
They're
said
not
this on
innocent
Friday?
civilians. Yep, on his
Okay.
broadcast Friday.
Okay.
And not a direct quote. That's basically the paraphrase of what he said. We have to look at their family members and why is this taking place? And then he went on and on disparaging Muslims that, they've only won two Nobel Prizes, and basically as if we're some, in subhuman species or whatever.
Well,
and
we
it's
all
just
know
sort of,
that number of Nobel Prizes is that's correlated directly with human rights accorded. So, I mean, that is a fair point.
right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
no, well, but wait, sorry. Say, what did you say again?
I'm
sorry,
just
I
being
missed what you said.
being snarky. I was saying we all know that
Okay.
Nobel Prizes are
Just making
correlated.
sure.
with,
I was like, oh, do I have to check you, Michael? But
Not
but,
in that
but
instance.
in all,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, not in that
Yeah.
instance, but
Yeah.
otherwise I will.
Right.
But in all seriousness, what was also disturbing when he made these sorts of comments and statements was that a big chunk of the audience clapped along with him.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
which is very disturbing.
Definitely.
Because if you have, it's one thing for a Hannity to sit there and speak his stuff, and everybody knows that he is anti-Muslim a huge chunk of the time and says ridiculous things. But when you have someone who markets themselves as the bastion of the voice of progress, saying this kind of stuff, then it normalizes the dehumanization of Muslims and Arabs and people from the Middle East and from wherever, anybody who may even appear to be Muslim in a mainstream level. And that is the problem with people like Bill Maher. Because if you don't view Muslims as human beings, then who cares when there's thousands of babies being killed in Gaza, or thousands being killed in Iraq, or thousands being killed in Afghanistan. And subconsciously or consciously, you tend to just not care.
Yeah, well, I remember actually one time, I had a conversation. I was at it was a Passover dinner or something. It was several years ago. I was in college, and these were not family members, fortunately. They were family friends, sort of. I probably actually played a big role in detonating the friendship between our families, but we ended up.
Why am I not surprised?
Yeah, well, you'll approve of these reasons, but so we got into
Okay.
we got into a conversation about I don't even remember what the specific issue was at that point, and really it just came down to fundamentally like. Killing kids isn't optimal, but these kids will probably grow up to be terrorist operatives anyways. And it was
Right.
just this kind of shockingly disturbing and racist perspective that I do think is getting, because we're very used to, I mean, we don't need to be shown. We know, that Hamas, in their, crude and incredibly technically unsophisticated way, we know that that they target civilians. We know they have a history of suicide operations. We know, this is not news. But what is news,
Right.
and is, I think, again, and I wonder if you see this possibly, a little bit more of a sense that inside Israel, there has been such a profound coarsening over the last couple of decades that you do see things like the death to Arab selfies. You do now have political parties that, Netanyahu coming out recently and saying, look, I'm not even going to pretend anymore that there's a two-state process. We're going to hold on to the West Bank, period. And then other prominent figures inside Israeli politics with real power saying, this is going to be one state. We're going to annex it. And Arabs are never going to get full citizenship rights, period. And if they want to leave and go live in a refugee camp in Jordan, maybe we'll help get them on a train or something. Do you think that, I mean, is that perspective, and it seems to me, I guess maybe specifically from a progressive perspective, because conservatives in the United States and Christian evangelicals who align with Israel for cynical reasons, they've said, for the reasons that, like, we're all going to go to hell because we helped the Messiah come back, and then they get to take over Jerusalem, which
Hmm.
the only thing that can make
That's a whole
the only thing that can make that situation
right. That's a whole
actually
nother
worse.
conversation,
That's a whole
right?
other conversation. But they have no problem saying, yeah, throw the Palestinians on trains. But
Right.
within a progressive conversation, this is another variation of the same question with Bill Maher. Do you think it's getting increasingly difficult to hold that tension of, I guess, being progressive on everything except Palestine?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think it's the one issue that is sort of universally acceptable to just have a one-sided representation. If you watch any broadcast, if you read any mainstream outlet, you rarely will see coverage of the other side. I mean, you'll get it here and there, but the ratio between one side versus the other is just, I mean, it's blaringly apparent how it's not balanced. And you need to, and the thing is, like going back to what I said earlier, you need to have the voices from both sides at the table. You need to have a very thorough discussion of the issues, of the underlying issues. I mean, you barely even hear a discussion about the fact that Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on the planet, and that a huge chunk of the population already lives in abject poverty.
Right.
And it's like, if if Netanyahu spews these talking points like, oh, well, we drop leaflets and tell them to leave. Well, where are they supposed to go? I mean, even the UN shelters are over capacity. They
Right.
don't have any money to go anywhere. And then you turn around and say, well, it's their fault for staying there. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. And
Right.
there needs to be a deeper level of engagement and conversation. And it just cannot continue this way. It's utterly out of control. I'm sorry. It's to that point where I'm just like, I think the Bill Maher show on Friday just completely flabbergasted me. Like, on the one hand, I wasn't surprised, but on the other, I'm like, wow, you're really going to have this conversation, and I love Nate Silver, brilliant guy, but yeah, I'm like, you had him on the panel. You should have had a Palestinian at least, or a Palestinian American, or a journalist who covered the region, something like that.
Or I mean, frankly,
with
someone like Daniel Levy. I mean,
Right.
the other kind of thing that's sort of astonishing is that there's actually no shortage of, I think I agree with you. I mean, the reality is you need to have more Palestinian. You just need to have a broader set of voices. But I mean, there's no shortage of incredibly smart and sophisticated. I think Daniel Levy, who was a negotiator under Ehud Barak, and now is in Europe. I've interviewed him several times, and you're not going to get. I mean, he both has progressive convictions and will articulate them, and actually cares about the human consequences of these things. But if you just want a kind of sharp analytic perspective on what's going on, you can't do better than a guy like that. And even the fact that it's not, that isn't in there is really astonishing, that we're not even moving to let's find and identify, if we're progressives, who are the progressive Israeli voices? Who are the progressive Palestinian voices?
Right.
Who are
Right.
What are they actually saying? We always should be looking to have the intellectual, political, and solidarity with people who actually represent our position on the ground. It would be like saying, I'm pro-American and I'm liberals, but I love America, so George Bush is great. Not looking at who was opposing George Bush, who was who was actively set.
And that's
go ahead.
Right. Thank you, and thank you for saying that, because while obviously there's a segment of the Israeli population that is in line with Netanyahu and the settlers that can be very aggressive, there's also a huge segment of their population that absolutely hates what he does. And there are plenty of Jewish people here that cannot stand what Netanyahu is doing, that they want a peaceful two-state solution so that everybody can live in a normal society and watch their children grow in peace. There are so many people. It's the same construct as there were so many Americans here that did not agree with what George Bush was doing in terms of the Iraq War, or what Obama does in terms of drones. But you never hear those voices. And that's the problem with this issue. And if you extrapolate the stereotyping of Muslims and the lack of Muslim voices in this discussion to other issues like what we're doing overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever, you rarely will hear a voice from the ground over there, or even Americans here that have some sort of family connection over there, or a deeper level of understanding of the issues. And I'm actually writing a piece about this right now, which will hopefully be published later today or tomorrow. You rarely see these voices included in the discussion, and that is a huge problem. And the excuse used to be back in the day that, oh, we don't know reporters on the ground, or we don't know anybody that can talk about this. But in this day and age, when there are things like social media and you can connect with somebody that's in a certain location in a second, what is your excuse then for not having them as part of the conversation?
Well, no, I think that that's absolutely right. And I think that that's a conversation, I mean, I've certainly had with people that, I don't think social media would have, as an example, stopped the invasion of Iraq. I think that's incredibly optimistic.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know that's not what you're saying.
Right.
I know that's not what you're saying. But I think what you are pointing to that's totally true is that we would have had, as an example, with shock and awe, you would have had people tweeting out what that actually meant. You wouldn't have had a totally contradictory Pentagon press release saying, on one hand, we literally have a bombing campaign called Shock and Awe right now, which in some ways speaks for itself. But it's also totally targeted and pinpointed, and we're being really responsible. You would have someone on the ground saying, this shrapnel just ripped through, an apartment. This, someone just ran out, with a child in their arms. That would, and we do have that in real time right now, like you're saying, and that makes it, as you say, a significantly less of an excuse. But before we wrap up, I do want to ask you a little bit more policy oriented, and we'll get, to this moving forward. I mean, it does seem to me, and another way in which I think that it's, that there are some shifts in some respects. As an example, I'm going to get to the John Kerry hot mic moment in a bit.
Right.
I think it's clear that was done. I think the consensus is
strategically.
Totally. I think that's totally obvious that the guy's not an idiot. It was very it seems very clear.
Right.
And whether or not I know, like, Max Blumenthal has Kerry's covering for himself for his kind of disastrous attempt at renewing the peace process. Other people have a more charitable interpretation, but I think the reality was that it's quite clear that was done intentionally. I think the fact that even again, voicing support for these operations in Gaza, I understand why that's why that's very offensive and I understand, but I do think, again, just looking at it from a very realist perspective, how pro forma the U.S. support is, and the fact that they have been calling for a ceasefire with the UN and with the Egyptians, as flawed as that ceasefire is, it does mark some type of shift. Now, Hamas has rejected that ceasefire, I think, for two reasons. I think, one, they're legitimately making demands that I outlined on the show last week, that they want to actually have not just a ceasefire. They would actually like to have some of the blockade lifted on Gaza. That's a perfectly legitimate demand, obviously. And I think Hamas, they have the convergence with the right in Israel, so they see this as an opportunity to renew some of their own totally floundering popularity. But
just real quick, just to interject, let's not forget, and I want to make very absolutely clear that I am, of course, in no way condoning what Hamas is doing, but I do want to point out that when the Egyptians presented this, so-called ceasefire agreement, they never actually consulted with Hamas.
Right.
So it's like, if you want two sides to come together, somebody needs to talk to them. It can't just be, all right, this is what it is, and throw it at them. And you have to bring people to the table in order for this to actually go into effect. And that's what needs to be done. And if the Egyptians want to, lead this on, then they need to engage with Hamas, or then have somebody else do it. But somebody needs to interject and actually make this ceasefire a reality and not just verbiage anymore.
And didn't basically Sisi spoke to Tony Blair, who this is like the other joke of this whole situation, that Tony Blair is actually the official envoy for the quartet for Middle East peace. I mean, I don't even, you can't even add subtext to that. Sisi, who now Blair is consulting through a contract through the United Arab Emirates, I believe, is now actually official. Blair and Associates is consulting the Sisi government. Sisi basically told Blair. Blair went to Netanyahu, and that was the communication of the ceasefire. Yeah, Hamas was not consulted in any way, shape, or form. I mean, what do you see, I guess, as we wrap up, going back to the ground and the public opinion level here, and then maybe also at the level now of negotiating some type of ceasefire? What do you think? What do you kind of see emerging over the next week or two in terms of the situation?
Oh boy, what do I see emerging, or what
Yeah.
do I hope to emerge? And
Either you
those
could
are like,
take it in two parts, whatever way
right.
you want
Those
to
are
go.
two
Yeah.
completely different questions. I mean, I
Yeah.
hate to just be, like the cynical whatever person that I'm being, the cynical journalist, but I unfortunately I do see this continuing for
Hmm.
some time, because I don't know how long it's going to be until there is an actual cessation of these hostilities. I mean, Kerry's going over there. Let's see what happens. But like I just said, you really need to engage both of these entities and bring them to the table to make this a reality. It can't just be, a one-sided discussion, a one-sided thing, and for the civilians on the ground, particularly for those in Gaza, they would like to have some sort of normalcy in their lives. They would like to have the freedom to move around without having to show their IDs. They would like to have access to things without everything being, going through blockades and things of that sort. And I really hope one day, I'm a cynical journalist with a sliver of optimism, and I hope that one day there can be an actual two-state solution, and that both sides can watch their kids grow in peace instead of seeing this horrific nightmare that has developed.
Yeah, and maybe maybe the work of broader humanization and calling things out, like these, like the Bill Maher tweet or whatever the hell he's talking about with Nobel prizes is part of it. Nida
Absolutely. Yep.
Nida Khan,
Yep.
independent journalist and analyst based here in New York. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.